February 1942. Along the Atlantic coast of the United States, the shoreline is blacked out. Cities are dark. The ocean is alive with unseen movement. And when the first explosions bloom offshore, the sirens begin to call women into the night. The Atlantic coast had been ordered into darkness long before the first shell struck. Streetlights were extinguished. Storefronts were shuttered. Windows were taped and covered along hundreds of miles of shoreline. America dimmed itself, not for efficiency or rationing, but for survival. The blackout was meant to hide cities from enemy eyes scanning the coast from the sea. It was meant to protect. Instead, it became the stage on which the war reached American soil. On cold coastal roads, engines idled in silence. Ambulances waited with headlights hooded. Their beams narrowed to thin slits that barely cut the darkness. Inside these vehicles sat women volunteers, wrapped in heavy coats, gloved hands resting on steering wheels, listening for the next signal. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons, yet they were among the first Americans expected to move when the attack came. The Atlantic that winter was no longer a boundary. German submarines prowled close to shore, slipping through shipping lanes with calculated patience. Tankers burned in open water, their fires towering high enough to silhouette beaches and boardwalks. The sea reflected orange light where it should have been black. For civilians watching from behind blackout curtains, the war announced itself without warning. When explosions echoed inland, emergency lines lit up. Fires spread from waterfront facilities. Shrapnel and debris struck homes built for peace, not bombardment, and in cities trained to remain dark and silent, movement itself became dangerous. Every engine risked exposure. Every light risked drawing attention. Yet the calls kept coming. The women assigned to ambulance duty moved anyway. They navigated streets erased of landmarks, guided by memory, intuition, and brief flashes of shaded light. Traffic signals were dark. Police whistles cut through the night. Civil defense wardens signaled with covered flashlights, marking safe passage through intersections where a single mistake could mean collision, or worse. Smoke drifted inland from burning fuel oil, carried by winter winds that stung the face and blurred vision. Inside the ambulances, stretchers rattled. Medical kits slid with each turn. The drivers understood instantly that training scenarios had ended. This was no drill. The blackout did not pause the injuries. The darkness did not slow the bleeding. And the ocean, invisible beyond the dunes, remained a threat long after the shells fell silent. These women drove toward fires they could not fully see, toward docks already collapsing, toward neighborhoods unsure whether the next blast would come from the sea or the sky. They did so, knowing that German submarines had surfaced within sight of shore, that shells had already landed, and that nothing marked them as untouchable. America was under attack, and in the absence of daylight, of certainty, and of protection, the nation's first responders on those coastal roads were women racing into darkness, engines low, lights dimmed, moving not away from danger, but directly toward it. By the time the blackout orders reached America's Atlantic cities, the war had already rewritten the rules of distance. Oceans no longer guaranteed safety. The fall of Europe had pushed the front line westward, and German naval strategy adapted accordingly. Submarines were no longer instruments of distant blockade alone. They became hunters operating within sight of American homes. The eastern seaboard was vulnerable in ways few had anticipated. Coastal cities burned brightly at night, their lights reflecting off the ocean's surface like beacons. Tankers followed predictable routes. Harbor defenses were limited. In the early months of the campaign, merchant ships sailed silhouetted against illuminated skylines, offering perfect targets to commanders watching through periscopes, only miles offshore. The response was swift but imperfect. Blackout regulations were enforced across coastal states. Civil defense organizations expanded rapidly, filling gaps that standing institutions could not cover alone. Volunteers became essential. Among them were women who stepped into roles once assumed unreachable: ambulance drivers, first responders, logistical operators in a war that had suddenly arrived without warning. Most of these women came from civilian life. Some had backgrounds in nursing or social work. Others had never driven under pressure before training began. They learned to maneuver heavy vehicles on narrow streets, to read maps without light, to maintain engines under blackout conditions. They memorized neighborhoods, hospital routes, fire access lanes, knowledge that could not be replaced once darkness erased signs and signals. The American Red Cross and local civil defense units standardized procedures as best they could. Ambulances were modified with hooded headlights and interior light discipline. Drivers practiced night navigation, with almost no illumination. They learned to stop instantly at the sound of sirens or wardens' whistles. Every movement had to balance speed with invisibility. What no manual could fully prepare them for was the psychological weight of coastal attack. Explosions at sea were not abstract news reports. They were visible, audible, immediate. Burning tankers cast shifting light across beaches and towns, temporarily undoing the blackout and exposing everything beneath it. Fires from fuel oil spread unpredictably, overwhelming local responders already stretched thin. In this environment, ambulance crews operated with incomplete information. Calls came in fragmented. Reports conflicted. Some alarms were false, others were not. The women behind the wheels understood that hesitation carried its own risk. Every delay meant another minute, without aid for someone injured by shrapnel, collapsing structures, or secondary fires. The enemy remained unseen but ever present. Submarines surfaced briefly to shell installations before slipping back beneath the waves. Their presence forced responders to assume that danger did not end once the blast faded. Roads could be targeted. Facilities could be struck again, yet the system demanded motion, not retreat. This was the world that shaped their mission. A coastline transformed into a front line, darkness turned into both shield and hazard. And the first calls rarely described the full picture. They never could. Reports came in fragments. An explosion offshore, flames near a pier, an injured dockworker pulled from debris, a family caught too close to shattered windows. In blackout conditions, even certainty became unreliable. Ambulance crews moved before confirmation arrived, because waiting meant surrendering time they could not afford to lose. Engines turned over softly, exhaust muffled by the heavy air. Hooded headlights traced narrow corridors through streets that felt unfamiliar, despite years of daily use. Without illuminated signs or traffic signals, every intersection became a calculated risk. Drivers leaned forward instinctively, scanning for movement, listening for sounds that might signal danger or guidance. The city's normal rhythms had been erased, replaced by whistles, coded knocks, and the distant rumble of fire. Near the waterfront, the scale of the attack revealed itself. Burning oil spread across the water's surface, driven by tide and wind, turning the sea into a shifting field of flame. The light it cast was uneven and deceptive, bright one moment, swallowed by smoke the next. It illuminated silhouettes of cranes, warehouses, and damaged hulls, then vanished as quickly as it appeared. The blackout was no longer absolute. It flickered, broken by destruction. Ambulances approached zones that had never been designed for rapid medical access. Piers collapsed under heat and shock. Debris littered access roads. Fire crews worked in near darkness, coordinating by shouted instructions and hand signals barely visible through smoke. Ambulance drivers threaded their vehicles through gaps that seemed to close as they moved, guided by wardens who emerged suddenly from the dark, marking paths with brief flashes of covered light. Inside the vehicles, the atmosphere shifted. Stretchers were deployed. Medical kits opened under red-filtered lamps. Injuries reflected the nature of the attack: burns from fuel fires, lacerations from shattered glass, concussions from blast shock. The women who drove these ambulances did not linger on the source of the damage. Their focus narrowed to the immediate stabilize, transport, move again. The enemy remained invisible, but its presence shaped every decision. There was no assurance that shelling would not resume, no guarantee that the road ahead was safe. Ambulances avoided unnecessary idling, engines kept ready for immediate departure. Crews learned to work with one eye on the patient and the other on the surrounding darkness. In some towns, civilians gathered silently behind darkened windows, watching the glow from the water and the movement of emergency vehicles passing through streets stripped of light. The sight was unsettling, not just because of the attack, but because it revealed how quickly normal life had given way to wartime discipline. No cheering, no panic in public, just controlled motion under threat. As the night progressed, exhaustion set in, yet the calls did not slow. Fires reignited as oil drifted ashore. Secondary explosions echoed unexpectedly. Each sound carried uncertainty, another hit, or simply the structure giving way under heat. Ambulance crews returned to staging areas briefly, only to be redirected moments later. This was first contact, not in the traditional sense of battle lines meeting, but in the collision between civilian infrastructure and military force. The women driving those ambulances understood that they were operating in a space the war had never intended to spare, and with every mile driven under blackout skies, that understanding hardened into resolve. They would keep moving as long as the calls came. By the second night of sustained alerts, fatigue became a silent adversary. Sleep came in fragments. If at all, ambulance crews rested in shifts, boots still on, coats folded within reach. Engines were rarely allowed to cool completely. The women who drove them measured time not by hours, but by the rhythm of calls: respond, return, wait, respond, again. The blackout intensified the strain. Depth perception vanished beyond the narrow cones of hooded headlights. Rain and coastal fog flattened the world into a uniform gray, turning roads into reflective traps, where oil, water, and debris blended together. A wrong judgment at speed could end a mission before it began. Yet hesitation carried its own cost. The balance between caution and urgency tightened with every mile. Near the shore, the environment remained unstable. Burning tankers continued to drift, their fires flaring unpredictably as fuel pockets ignited. Wind shifted smoke inland, reducing visibility to a few yards. Sirens sounded briefly, then cut off to avoid detection, leaving crews to navigate by instinct and memory alone. Even the sound of the ocean changed, its steady rhythm interrupted by distant detonations and the collapse of weakened structures. Psychological pressure mounted alongside physical exhaustion. Every flare of light offshore raised the same question: was it fire or another attack beginning? Every vibration through the pavement could be dismissed as heavy equipment, or recognized as something far worse. Ambulance drivers operated without the illusion of safety. They knew submarines had surfaced within range. They knew shelling could resume without warning. Still, they drove. In several coastal towns, response zones overlapped with evacuation routes, complicating movement. Civilians moved quietly under wardens' instructions, their faces briefly illuminated as ambulances passed. Some carried children, others carried nothing at all. The women behind the wheels absorbed these images without comment, storing them somewhere beyond immediate thought, focusing instead on the road ahead. Equipment failures added to the strain. Headlight covers loosened, engines strained under constant use. Tires picked up debris that could not be seen until it was too late. Maintenance crews worked rapidly between calls, patching what they could under minimal light. There was no luxury of full repair. Functionality, not perfection, became the standard. At its peak, the pressure was relentless. Calls overlapped, hospitals operated under reduced lighting, their staff pushed to capacity. Ambulance crews delivered patients and turned around almost immediately. The stretchers barely cleared before new instructions arrived. There was no clear marker for when the danger would pass. No announcement that the worst had ended. The breaking point came not as a single moment, but as accumulation. The realization that the coast might remain a target, that tonight could repeat tomorrow, that the war did not require their permission to intrude again. For many of these women, the understanding settled quietly, without panic or ceremony. This was endurance, not heroics. Motion sustained under uncertainty. Decisions made while tired, in darkness, under threat. The blackout had erased visual clarity, but it had sharpened something else: commitment. When the calls continued, they answered. When the road vanished into smoke and shadow, they followed it anyway. The attacks along the coast did not end in a single night. They faded unevenly, shifting location, intensity, and method as patrols increased and defenses adapted. Over time, the ocean grew quieter. The fires offshore burned out. The blackout remained, but its urgency softened, replaced by routine rather than alarm. For the women who had driven through those nights, the transition was subtle. There was no formal signal that the danger had passed, only the gradual return of silence. Damage assessments focused on ships lost, fuel destroyed, and defensive failures corrected. Reports documented submarine activity, response times, and structural vulnerabilities. Civil defense logs recorded numbers, calls answered, patients transported, hours logged. What those records could not fully capture was the human cost of sustained readiness under threat, or the effect of seeing familiar streets transformed into potential targets. When blackout restrictions were eventually relaxed, light returned cautiously, street lamps came back in stages, storefronts reopened their windows, coastal towns resumed patterns that had been interrupted but not erased. The ambulances, worn and patched, returned to standard service. Equipment was refurbished, schedules normalized, yet the memory of those nights did not dissolve with the darkness. For the women who had volunteered, the experience reshaped their understanding of war and place. The battlefield had not been overseas. It had been the roads they knew, driven without light, carrying neighbors instead of strangers. Their contribution did not alter naval strategy or sink submarines. It sustained the human infrastructure that made endurance possible. In post-war narratives, attention shifted outward, to distant campaigns, to decisive battles fought far from American shores. The coastal threat became a footnote, overshadowed by larger operations. The women who responded during blackouts were rarely singled out. Their work was categorized as support. Their courage folded quietly into the broader effort. Yet their legacy persisted in more practical ways. Civil defense planning evolved. Emergency response protocols incorporated lessons learned under blackout conditions. The assumption that distance guaranteed safety was permanently discarded, and the precedent stood when the nation required immediate action under threat. Women had already demonstrated they could operate where risk and responsibility converged. They had driven without visibility, without certainty, and without recognition. They had responded not because they were ordered, but because the call came, and someone had to answer it. In the absence of light, of reassurance, and of applause, they kept the system moving. When the coast finally slept without fear of unseen silhouettes offshore, it did so in part because during its darkest nights, American women had raced into the blacked-out streets and refused to stop.